I think someone warned me. I'm checking my mic now. Should be coming in okay. Minor glitch there for a second. Um, so we're going to be dealing with this topic that is used in Muslim circles and Jewish circles a little differently. Muslims use it in terms of stating the Bible's been corrupted. Jews use it in terms of being able to dismiss the New Testament. Um, hmm. I'm gonna put on my audio settings just to check myself. This is just a little sound check here, but it allows me to hear check. Okay. Um, there we go. Okay, that was just a way of me checking. Um, so, it's used in both. It's the type of objection I really like to deal with from both sides. I stated that you're going to see some poll cards. We're getting ready to set up Patreon, but there are gifts, there are giveaways that you give as people go ahead and I don't want to say patronize you, but there are levels. I know that Vocab has Star Wars characters. I was trying to think of Jewish characters, but I don't think anyone wants to be a menorah or an Ark of the Covenant. So I'm still thinking through that. The poll was just to indicate. Most of you don't know that I used to write poetry. My wife kind of is sad. Before I was able to teach the scriptures, I did a lot of poetry teaching the scriptures. And so that's one of the things that we're thinking about. I'm also revamping the Haggadah, the Christ in the Passover order of service booklet that I give out when I'm speaking on the road. So if you see those cards come up, take advantage of the poll. I'm looking towards how to best set up that station. And so you are my community. In fact, hopefully, most of you will also visit on Patreon. Can't bring it up any higher on my end. Looking towards how to best set up that station. Okay, I think that's up as high as it'll go. Um, so let's see if it straightens out. Okay. Well, that's great. I appreciate you guys that just want to be patrons. I just want to provide as good an experience as I can, given some of my limitations. So let's get on with this evening because you folks have joined me, and I'm so excited to have folks there. By the way, someone new subscribed to the channel, so I don't know if they'll be joining us tonight, but that's fine. They can view at their leisure. I'm always excited about people becoming kind of getting their feet wet in the community. So I'm going to switch over to our lesson for tonight. Now, again, it'll take a few minutes and it'll also take the window capture being the window capture. And that's kind of a thing in itself. So it'll just take a second or two here. And that will come up. And we're going to be dealing with whether the Apostle Paul called the law a curse. This is a big deal for Jewish people. They view the Torah as a gift from God. He is revealing of himself and what he wanted from them as a covenant community. In this case, I'm using a Muslim objection. Now, what Muslims would say is that if Paul called the law a curse and the Old Testament doesn't call the law a curse, then obviously your scriptures contradict each other and they must have been corrupted. The Quran states that both Jews and Christians corrupted the scripture. Why didn't they just corrupt them in the same direction then is a really good question, but it isn't the question we're going to be dealing with. But it is something to keep in mind as you get Muslim objections to the scriptures. Hold them to the logical ramifications of those objections. And so, that's something that could be asked. Well, if they were corrupting it in cahoots with each other, you think the stories would go ahead and match. I've been dealing a little with a gentleman from Morocco who's thrown a few new ones at me. And I dealt with one episode with his objections. I haven't dealt with his latest objections. Very hard to understand, and he likes to use the fallacy of shotgun, where he just keeps throwing objections rapidly at you, and you never have a chance to deal with them. Let's deal with objections to the New Testament, and did Paul call the law a curse? So let's move through that. I want to state the objection for you very clearly. The Apostle Paul called the law a curse, but the Hebrew scriptures regard the law as a gift. And so that's the general objection. Therefore, there is a contradiction, but clearly we have two statements that don't match. And so we're going to take care of this. This is what's called creating a false dilemma. That's the basic fallacy we're dealing with here. Now, the individual offering this doesn't think it's a false dilemma, but we're going to go ahead and take care of this by looking at what Paul really did think of the law and demonstrate that the dilemma he's proposing isn't really a dilemma at all, which is, by the way, what you do when you're faced with a false dilemma. The key is, what don't you know, or what isn't being taken into account by your opponent that creates the dilemma that isn't really a dilemma. So the argument fleshed out further is that Paul calls the law a curse. The Hebrew scriptures consider it a blessing. Paul's statements about the law contradict the Hebrew scriptures. And then QED, the New Testament, particularly Paul's writing, cannot be scripture. Now, both Jews and Muslims do not like Paul. There is what's called the Jewish reclamation of Jesus, where you're getting more and more comments that Jesus was a good rabbi and a good Jewish man and very wise. And it's really the Apostle Paul who created Christianity. This has been around forever among the Jewish community. So much so that Jews for Jesus wrote a pamphlet a while back called Paul, Apostle or Apostate. You will get this from Muslims because while the Gospels are accepted as corrupted versions of the Injil, Paul's writings are not respected in the Muslim community. And so there's a real issue. And so that's the argument fleshed out a little bit more. It may be stated a slightly different way, but that's basically what we're dealing with here. And so let's dig in a little bit and deal with this a little bit more. I'm going to switch this, okay? The verse that is being used here, where the law is considered to be calling, where Paul is considered to be calling the law a curse, is Galatians 3:13. Now, it's going to be very important that you know that. Let me read that to you. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, as it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So this is the verse that's being used to state that Paul called the law, particularly the Pentateuch, a curse, and the Hebrew scriptures consider it to be a gift. Therefore, there's a contradiction. But I want to introduce you to the verse that has the terminology in it, because that's where we really need to start. What verse in the New Testament is the opponent referring to and creating this false dilemma from? And so we're dealing with Galatians 3:13. Now, one of the things that occurs, whether it be an atheist or a Muslim, is that the whole story of Scripture is not being considered. Folks, you can get rid of most of these supposed contradictions by placing the verse back, not only in its immediate context, but in the biblical narrative. That is terribly important. The problem of evil, which is not a scriptural issue as far as one particular verse, is settled when you take the problem of evil in terms of the great narrative of Scripture and what's going on. So this is where Zion's banner this is where Zion's banner lives. This is where I live, is let's leverage the biblical narrative to deal with things. So we look at the authorial intent, and then we look at the authorial intent in connection with that authorial intent being influenced by and affected by the narrative that God is writing and the place that that appears in the canon. Okay? So let's look at the big picture here. The way we're going to deal with this objection, the way we're going to peel the onion tonight, is Paul's theology does not support the first premise. Or does Paul's theology support the first premise? I'm going to argue no. Does the language really support the first premise? I'm going to argue no. Does the background support the first premise? That's that Paul calls the law a curse, and I'm going to say no. So I'm going to peel it from three different layers. I'm going to peel it from the fact that the background of the verse does not support that Paul is calling the law a curse. The language of the verse doesn't support that Paul is calling the law a curse. And Paul's overall theology does not support that Paul is calling the law a curse. And that's the way I'm peeling the onion here. So let's deal with the background of Galatians. This is terribly important. I took this from Moses Silva in his commentary. He's a very well-known scholar. Nice first name. It's the Spanish for Moses. With regard to certain historical questions surrounding Galatians, there is very little doubt. Few scholars seriously question, for example, that Paul was the author. And again, the text makes quite clear that certain individuals were creating spiritual sedition in the Galatian community by preaching a false gospel, pressuring Gentile believers to observe Jewish ceremonies, particularly circumcision. This means that as Paul's dealing with the law, he's dealing with the law in terms of sanctification and justification as it applies to Gentile believers. You see, there's a specific situation that Paul is dealing with that is going to affect this verse and what he is stating about the law. And so we begin by looking at the context and then the verse, and then we also look at the greater context of Scripture in terms of the meta-narrative and see what is going on and how it relates to the full plan of God. So let's understand the thinking of the Judaizers. By the way, if you tune in for nothing else tonight, you're going to get some insight into what the Judaizers thought. Paul is dealing with a group of people, and he is dealing with the way they thought. So I want to introduce you to the way Judaizers thought in the first temple period. Basically, they thought like this, okay? God's covenant blessings were attached to Israel, and the individual experience of these blessings was through connection to Israel. Okay? God being the king, Israel the covenant community, and then the individual through his relationship with Israel, which he kept through law observance, is the way an individual experienced the covenant blessings of God. So the Judaizers are like this. These Gentile believers are coming into Messiah, but in order to experience the covenant blessings of God, they still need to be connected with Israel. How are they going to be connected with Israel? Well, they need to come under the ceremony. So they are saved by Jesus, but their experience of the covenant blessing still needs to come through them identifying with Israel through the ceremonies, including circumcision of Israel. Now, that gives you some thinking into what they're thinking. It isn't a question about whether the law alone can save. It's the idea that the covenant blessings of God need to be experienced not only through that ultimate justification by Jesus, but also through the practice of Jewish ceremony and forms. I was talking to a Arab Christian brother who runs a church near here. And so he was talking to me, and the concept of this corporate identity thing is really very strong in Semitic thinking. And so I laid on him what I laid on you, and he loved it. He said, "You still think like a Mideasterner." I don't know. Being of the Eastern European Jewish approach, I've got some Aristotelian thinking locked up in there, but I still can recognize that sort of thinking and see that in the Bible as I'm reading it and relate to it. So let's go to John. Now, this insight in John's going to really rock your world, I hope. because it's really incredible. John 15, 1 through 3 talks about Jesus being the vine and us being the branches. Now, I've dealt with it before, but I want to put this in its framework here of this corporate identity, the blessings being connected with identification with Israel, since God covenanted with Israel sort of mentality in the first century, and really show you John in a little bit of a different light. John 15, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. You can put vine dresser there. Okay, it's an older term. I'm using the King James. Not because I think that God originally wrote the Bible in 15th century English or 16th century English. It was just very easy to transfer the verses. I generally use the new KJV. But you know what? For those folks who are really attached to the King James, have a good evening of it. If you watch this video, you're going to see AV all the way. Jesus says, I am the vine and my Father is the husbandman. Translate that to modern language, the vine dresser. Why is Jesus picking this vine stuff here? Now, most of us look right past that. We say, well, we know what a vine is, and we know basically that the fruit comes off the vine, and we know that the vine dresser was supposed to take care of the vine. Actually, he pruned and clipped it and tended to it. What we probably haven't seen is that Jesus is aware that the audience he's talking to knows Isaiah 5:7. Isaiah is a very important book. He was called the Prince of Prophets. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. He looked for judgment, but behold oppression, and for righteousness, but behold a cry. This is the song of the vineyard, where God describes that Israel was supposed to produce the fruit of the kingdom, but failed to. So, this is terribly important, because this is the background of John 15. Let me put it to you this way. Jesus is making a really powerful, strong statement here. It is not Israel that is the center of the covenant community. The covenant community is not in Israel, it's in Messiah. The covenant community, the vine, is not Israel anymore. The vine is Messiah. You don't have to be connected to Israel to be blessed. I am the vine. I am the source. I'm what you need to be connected to get covenant blessings. Do you see what a powerful statement this is? For the Judaizers, Jesus may indeed ultimately save them from their failures to keep the law. That wasn't necessarily the big question for Gentile believers. It's, did Gentile believers have to identify with Israel as the covenant community through which the blessings were experienced and mediated? That's terribly important here. And Jesus is saying absolutely no. So now you understand the thinking of the Judaizers. It was Jesus plus the law allows one to experience the covenant blessings. Because the law identified you with the covenant community, Jesus ended up covering your failures, kind of like the Mormons. You're saved after all that you can do. And so you need to be connected to the covenant community also. And so that's where the Judaizers are thinking. Paul is dealing with that very thing in Galatians. And so that's the backdrop of what's going on here. And so that is terribly important. And it's that thinking that Paul is countering. So when Paul is going to discuss the law in terms of the curse of the law, you need that backdrop. Remember, the argument is, given this verse, Paul is calling the law a curse. The Torah calls the law or law of God a blessing. The Torah and the New Testament are in contradiction. Obviously, that indicates a lack of inspiration. We are just dealing with the background of the verse right now. But I wanted to give you that background because that's where we need to sort of start. Paul's concern is not that the law is being regarded as good, even though it's a horrible thing. Paul's concern is the danger that the gospel will be undermined by adding law keeping. Folks, it's real simple. Paul didn't believe in Jesus plus. Okay? And this is the big issue for Paul. Jesus plus this, plus that. No, Jesus plus nothing. And that's the point. And so our union with Christ is based on our faith in him and his work, and nothing can be added to that in order to experience the covenant blessings of God. And so that's the backdrop of Galatians. Does the background support the first premise, which is that the law that Paul calls the law a curse? No, it doesn't. Since Paul is discussing the law in a narrow sense related to a specific problem, so we have to understand that he is not generally considering the law to be a curse. In other words, the background of Galatians indicates that he's dealing with a very narrow problem and dealing with the law in a narrow sense in relation to justification and sanctification, not in terms of instruction. And so we cannot say that Paul is in general calling the Pentateuch a curse. Now, the reason I say Pentateuch is that's what Jews consider the Torah or the law. So let's put it in that second temple setting here. Because also often people just reduce the law to the regulations. That's never the way a Jew in Jesus' day looked at it. Now let's talk about the language. Okay, the background doesn't support the premise that Paul called the law a curse. What about the original language? I threw some Greek in here, not because you have to be a Greek expert, but do not think I'm pulling this out of a hat. When I talk about Greek grammar, I'm doing so having had material in seminary related to Greek grammar. We had to learn to read and understand basic Greek grammar. We had to learn to recognize case endings. I still use it related to devotions as I do Hebrew. Am I as fluent? No. When you don't use it constantly, you lose it. So in seminary, there's a tendency to lose what you know simply because you're not using it every day and you don't have teachers quiz you quite the same way. But let's dig into it. Paul is careful to say we're redeemed from the curse of the law, not that the laws, and I said occurs in Greek grammar, supports the curse is connected to the law, but the law itself is not a curse. Okay? Let's do it like this. Paul is not saying the law is a curse according to the grammar. He's saying there's a curse that is connected with the law that can happen. Now, I put it up here, taste, and then the next Greek word is the word fruit, kataros, to namu, okay? Now, if there's a little mispronunciation here, hopefully my Greek teacher will forgive me, okay? But you have the fruit of the law. Now, if you're looking at the Greek here, look at what looks like U there. It looks like an O and a U. It's an omicron, and it's another Greek letter, okay? You will see it with the last two words. That's a genitive case ending. So it's the curse of the law. It's not the law is a curse. If I wanted to say in Greek, the law is a curse, I could do it by using the word the law in the nominative case. That means it would be the subject, is a curse, and then that could be in the nominative case also. Okay, but it would be what's called a subject predicate. Okay, and I would stick it that way, and I'd be saying the law is a curse. All right, that's not what Paul says. He uses the genitive to indicate that there is a curse connected with the law. And so the original language is not Paul saying that the law is a curse, because the case endings don't indicate that, and the sentence structure doesn't indicate that. So the background is Paul's talking about a limited abuse of the law in a limited situation related to a non-Jewish audience that is having pressed upon it the law. So the background doesn't indicate that Paul is saying the law is a curse. The original language doesn't indicate that Paul is saying the law is a curse. So the original language and case endings don't support that first premise. One would have to read into the verse to believe that Paul was saying this contrary to the grammar. In other words, I'm making assumptions about what the verse is saying that the grammar and background of the verse don't support. All right? This is really good exegetical technique here. Now, in the case of a Muslim, it may be because he doesn't understand, or because he swallowed this argument from someone else, or he's not dealing with the scriptures honestly. All right, either because his beliefs are not allowing him to think very clearly about this, or because in some cases he's deliberately throwing a red herring out there. And let's be honest, with Islamic polemicists, there is red herring throwing. We have to be honest about this. And we can't just deny that that does happen. I don't know the gentleman. I know the gentleman I'm dealing with is doing some things with arguing that I find less than genuine. Okay, but the original language and background don't support this, and that's not the way you do Bible study. What is Paul's theology of the law like? Now, volumes have been written on this, and I'm even dealing with it in my dissertation. Uh, there are people that have doctors of ministry and even PhDs in Paulinian theology. So I'm not going to try to unscrew the inscrutable tonight. Paul wrote a major part of the New Testament. His theology is complicated to say the least. And so we can't say that, I'm going to give you the definitive answer on Paulinian participation. So, but I can give you some general information about Paul's theology in relation to the law. So let me kind of unfold this for you. Paul in Romans 7:14 says, "We know the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin." So as Paul's discussing what I would think is sanctification in 7, he talks about salvation and sanctification. Um, Paul makes some statements. Now, what he's saying is the problem is not with the law, it's spiritual. Its origin is God. But I am carnal, sold unto sin. I am predisposed to sin. I am influenced by sin. And therefore, the problem is not with the law. We'll notice the but there. The problem is with me. I am motivated by this human nature that's fallen and a fallen world, which is what I see constantly. And so I will be easily misled. I think that's why God refers to people as sheep, because sheep are a little dumb and they're easily misled. And so I am carnal. I don't think of things spiritually easily on my own. I'm distracted, dissuaded, um, and have problems. And so the law is spiritual, but my nature is not in line with that law because it's being influenced by other things, namely sin. And so that's where the discord occurs. And we see from this verse that Paul considers the law not to be accursed, but to be spiritual. And the problem is not with the nature of the law, the problem is with the nature of man. See, Paul diagnoses the problem. God's law is good. The problem is we fall short. And so the curse of the law has to do with our nature in connection with the nature of the law and them being out of sync with each other. But let's go on to another verse. Does Paul consider the law to be a curse in his general theology of the law? Well, we know that the law is good if a man uses it lawfully. This is 1 Timothy 1:8 in the King James. Notice he says, if a man uses it lawfully. Paul states that the law is good, therefore he's not stating it's a curse. He's concerned about the wrong use of the law. This is hardly likely that he would say something like this if he viewed the law to be a curse, but rather its misuse is a problem. So Paul's concern is not that he hates the law. Paul's concern is that men are misusing God's law in a way that God never intended. Did he understand that the law told me something about God? Well, the law certainly tells me something about God. It's very instructive about God's nature. I learn a lot about God from the Pentateuch. Do you know there are even statements about God's nature, such as Exodus 34:6 and 7, that are repeated 5 times throughout the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures? So, yes, I learn a lot about God's dealings with humankind, the nature of the world, and the nature of human beings from the 5 books of Moses. What do I mean by the law's misuse? If I use the law as a means by which to barter God's favor, which we call self-righteousness, or I use the law as a means by which I can judge my holiness and actually the holiness of others, I can run into trouble. Because the outward performance of the law does not guarantee the inward attitude of the heart. This is what the prophets were big on. I can go through the motions very easily. Okay? And so Paul is concerned about the law being used for justification or sanctification. He is not denying its value for instruction. Now, a good deal of my dissertation actually touches on this, because certain one law groups and even the Hebrew Israelites will tout the law in terms of a means of sanctification or justification. And so then we start to have some problems. Okay? But Paul's concern is the law's misuse, not the law's use. So I know that we're running a little quick here, okay? And maybe a little quicker than I wanted to run. But Paul's theology doesn't indicate he believed the Torah to be a curse, but rather he believed its misuse was definitely a curse. He believed that man's inability to be lawful put one in a position of judgment. Nowhere does he indicate that Paul believes the content of the 5 books of Moses was a curse. He was deeply concerned about its misuse in terms of salvation and sanctification. Paul repeatedly quotes from the 5 books of Moses, which he hardly would do if he considered it to be a curse. And so this objection is playing off of a false dichotomy. Paul never makes the statement the law is a curse. He never believed the law was a curse. What he was dealing with was an incredible misuse of the law, which even the prophets themselves point out when they talk about hating the Israelite sacrifices and new moon sacrifices. And I'm thinking particularly in Isaiah, but the passage isn't coming to mind. I was just reading it the other day, where God complains about their sacrifices, not because he hated the sacrificial system, but rather he hated their abuse of the system. And so that's Paul's overarching concern. And the gentleman who's posing this is pulling Paul's statement in Galatians 3:13 out of the context, first of all, out of the language, okay? Then he's pulling it out of its immediate context. Then he's pulling it out of its place in the canon. By the way, one of the big claims of Islam is they'll talk about these contradictions. And I was talking to a young man the other day, and I said, look, there's an easy way out of this. Point out that the New Testament and Old Testament were not written to exactly the same audience. If I write a letter to 2 different people, and I say somewhat different things in the letter, that is not a contradiction. A contradiction would be saying the same thing to exactly the same audience during the same time period and having those statements be mutually exclusive. And so that's often missed too. Um, the New Testament is not written to exactly the same composition of audience, and it's not written at the same time. And I had to explain, well, I took the time to explain to this young man who actually did an internship here and has become like part of the family, that when I'm dealing with these sorts of issues, it is important, very important, to point out that what we mean by progressive revelation is not that one verse replaces another, but rather God gives additional information in relation to the people he's talking to at the time he's speaking to them. In other words, God speaks to real people in real time and space in the scriptures and gives additional information when it is important to have. And that's what we mean by progressive revelation. It is distinctly different than Islam's abrogation, where one verse replaces another verse. Paul is dealing with a different situation and a different audience in a different time. And so he is making very clear what he does not want this audience, what God does not want this audience to do. He is not necessarily taking away from the value of the law given according to its authorial intent at its time when Israel was starting out as a theocracy and had come out of a pagan environment for roughly 400 years. That is not Paul's authorial intent. That's not where it fits in the canon. And so we have to take things in their proper context. So as you're peeling the onion, understand what God's doing. He's giving new information in the play during the scene that is appropriate to it. And that's where the issue is. He is not taking something and getting rid of what came before it, but he is placing it in its proper context through new information given to an audience in a different situation so that we can understand the overall flow. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Now, this is a short treatment of a single objection. This objection is stated in a dozen different ways and comes up all the time with a Muslim audience. I've only dealt with one version of this. And so that's why this is a little shorter this evening, because this is really a very compact sort of argument. Was Paul apostate in his views on the law? No, he was not. Judaism at the time recognized differences that would come during the Messianic kingdom. Paul understood that the epoch, the era of the Messianic era had begun. And so there was incredible things going on, that a new phase or a whole big thing related to God's plan was being revealed. And this is how this plays out given that. And so that's where this all is. And so I'm not even going to, someday it would be really cool to do some stuff related to the whole argument in Hebrews. Somebody was mentioning Hebrews because Hebrews has a similar backdrop. What's the key? Jesus is the center of the community. Paul is not disagreeing with Jesus on his view of the law. Paul is not having a different view of the law. Paul is talking about the law in relation to the Messianic era and a particular problem that arose during the Messianic era in relationship to the law. And that's what we're dealing with here. And that changes everything. And so Paul's again viewing the law through the Messianic lens and through the lens of the big story of God, and then making statements related to this unique situation. And that's what we're dealing with. So, I know we moved through this a little quicker. I'm taking discrete objections as they kind of come up and dealing with them. But I'm really thrilled for the folks that came here and the new folks. And then seeing some folks that were new that are coming back and viewing this again. The next time your Muslim friend raises these sorts of issues, you can point out one, um, the Hebrew scriptures were written prior to the coming of the Christ. Changes were expected after the Christ. The audience is now the nations who have come under Jesus as the community. And I am seeing some questions. I do want to answer those. And the audience is not exactly the same, and the period in God's plan, or where we are traveling along God's plan, is not the same. I'm going to switch to the slide, then I'm going to go back because there's one or two questions here, and I want to deal with them. And so I'm going to do the switcheroony, which allows for the music, and allows for the questions, and allows for talking, and sharing. And I really like the slideshow and the music, but you guys could tell me what you think. I'm going to turn the music down a little, even though it's neat. I don't know, that's so relaxing. I almost wish they played it at the end of my cycle class. It's just so neat. So, I was asked, did Peter say that some of the things that Paul writes are hard to understand? Yes, he did. He also says, which some people twist to their own destruction, which is exactly what's happening. Paul is very complicated and intricate in his theology. Remember that he was a Pharisee. He was very highly trained in the law, in the Torah, and in rabbinical methods. Peter, I like the pictures too. I will put new ones up as I get out there. I'm supposed to go out and do some outreach this week. You can be praying. It's going to be about 107, and I'm going out to the baseball game for about an hour and a half. I don't know if I'll make it much, 2 hours, and hopefully I'll have some good conversations and get to share the Lord. So that's the big thing, is a Diamondbacks game, and so I'm going to see what I can do with that. Be continued. I am going to be starting our apologetics and outreach group at Hillside in September. I am really excited. And so I'm hoping to be able to see that become a regular program in the church. And I'm hoping to get some people out of their salt shaker. Any prayers you want to offer for that, I would appreciate, because we need believers to get out and about. Some other people are having some problems with heat too. So, alrighty. So, that was one question. I'm looking to see if there's anything else up there that people said that they wanted a little more info about, or that would be good. Have we come a long way ontologically? Yes and no. I'm working on a taped response to rationality rules. I think even the African tribesman was not dumb enough to think the world came into existence by itself. So in some ways, we're stupider. You know, at least the goat thing, as ridiculous as it was, is not as ridiculous as believing that the metaphysical goods of this universe, such as love and ethics, are all just illusions in our little brain cells due to chemical reactions, as well as our consciousness. And so I think sometimes we can be even more absurd. I am respectful of those as I talk to them, and I understand that's their religious conviction, and there are sometimes personal reasons for it. Sometimes they just think science can answer everything, which I think is a religion in itself. But I think that's kind of silly in its own way. So I find the worldview given by the Bible to be much more compelling, much more interesting, and it gives worth and hope. And I don't see any way any other worldview does that. My 2 cents. Um, uh, there are some other comments, but they don't seem to be questions. So I am thrilled for the comments. Someone commented on the weightier matters of the law. Yes, I believe there's a hierarchy in the law. I agree with Walter Kaiser that as you look at the law, Jesus' statement seems to indicate a hierarchy in the law, and that there is room for believing that the moral aspects of the law carry over as they're repeated in the New Testament, but there is nothing to suggest that all the ceremonial aspects of the law carry over. There is much in Hebrews to be very clear that they're not carried over. And beyond this, we have the epistle to the Hebrews to indicate the sacrificial system is not carried over. And so I think Jesus is pointing to the spirit of Torah, that's what I call it, which are the weightier matters of the law. So, and someone actually had one of their relatives in the chat last week, and I loved it, and actually heard for them. So, you are welcome. Family is welcome. So if you have family that loves these things, they are welcome to join us. A lot of those are the pictures of the Urban Apologetics Conference that VOCAP set up, actually, and we'll probably be setting up again. So that's kind of where some of those are. One or two are in a pulpit. A bunch of them are First Friday, both recently and non-recently. Okay. Someone was making some comments related to our legal system, and I appreciate that. Oh, Jonathan, Jonathan made a comment about family and fringes. You may not understand that they're called tzitzit. There are two garments that have them. And there's what's called a talit katan, and then there's what's called a talit gadol. I have made use in my devotional time of the talit gadol. The talit katan, I'm very familiar with. I'm not going to discuss that. It's worn under the shirt, so it's kind of like underwear to me. And I don't discuss my underwear. I would say that they were designed as reminders. And actually, so were the mezuzah. And so, well, I'll let you in on a secret. I don't wear my fringes out, but do I wear a talit katan? I began to do that. And that's just personal. And it's not a requirement, and if I forgot, I wouldn't be upset. It's just something I have available to me, and I have made use of it. The talit gadol, which is the prayer shawl worn on the outside, I make use of when I'm having devotional times, and along with tefillin. And so I don't know if Jonathan's familiar with tefillin, but I still occasionally lay tefillin. I don't do it quite as regularly due to schedule. I've started to get back into it. Something you guys need to do? No, because Paul says you don't. But I'd encourage you, find things that function the same way. If you can put Bible verses up, guess what? That's what a mezuzah was supposed to do. And so that's great. I don't think the string around the finger works so well. But you might have Bible verses in your purse or something and review them on the bus. That is absolutely great. I do thank Jonathan for sharing that. It helps me understand the practice and some of the things that you're dealing with. So I appreciate that. So, um, okay, reacted with some of the things here. Some of this conversation between you guys, and I love to listen to you guys talk too, but I don't want to jump in where you guys are sharing with each other. It's kind of like coming into a room and butting into someone else's conversation. But when I see things like what Jonathan's explaining, I can relate to them and, hopefully end up making a few comments as somebody from the background who follows Jesus and has been working through these things and loves how they relate to apologetics. Okay. It is great. I'm going to do a wave here because I saw someone I saw again, and I'm thrilled to. I'm going to pronounce it Malachi. I hope someone doesn't get mad at me. I don't pronounce it according to the pronunciation of the great Italian prophet Malachi. Uh, Malachi, and I'm going to just do a wave. I'm thrilled. Um, hey guys, I want to get these out more. If you think these topics are valuable, and I know you guys are doing all you can, but it'll be so fun as God builds our community. So I'm excited about that. And maybe Patreon, Patreon is in the future. I got to get the video done and I got to get everything else done, but we're working on it. And so that's kind of where we're at. I will let you know that tomorrow will be a little longer. We're going to be covering basically the baptism of Jesus, the inauguration of the King. And so there'll be some cool background on baptism and ceremonial washing in Judaism, what it meant and why it was important. And so I invite you to come back. I am thrilled with what is going on in our community. I see growth, I see cool things happen, and I know that God will grow things at his rate. So you guys are doing the watering by hitting the subscribe and liking and recommending it to other people, and God will bring the growth. And again, if you can't make it, tune in anyway. I love it. And I understand the way schedules are. So that is, kind of where we're at. I love it. And I can see your comments. If you watch something afterwards and you comment on it, I still see your comments. So I know you're there. And so that tells me that, hey, your schedule interfered, but you tuned in. You came into the community. You just came in at a little different time and watched what was going on. I am going to start to probably wind us down a little bit, but I'm thrilled with everyone here. And I pray that God would bless your evening. I know it's later where you are. May he give you a cool, restful sleep. And I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow, or you will still see me if you tune in later. And so that's terribly exciting, and I will be able to hear, and I knew. Some streams are longer than others, but that's okay, because God knows what he's doing. Okay, I'm going to leave the conversation going, but I'm going to kind of move us towards the rest of our evening. That doesn't mean you have to go. Oh, wow. I recognize another name. Oh, let me do a wave here. This is so cool. Us Jewish folks, it's really cool when we can get like the I seeing things, kind of move from there. So that's cool. And so I'm going to try this. There we go. Excellent. As I tune out, you guys can keep talking, um, understanding that the music will probably cut out. Uh, but I'm going to do a good evening. I'm thrilled. Shout out to Brittany. Shout out to John, only because I've seen you here before, and it's good to see you again. Hey, for you real, we'll say, I almost want to say founding members of the community, folks that have been really faithful and here all along. Roxby, um, I know from what I understand, you had a part in the camera. I'm using it. So cool. Thank you. Nate, uh, Jonathan, Becky, if you're still there. I'm going to wish you a good night too, and be thrilled that you are here. Um, Corinth, you have been a great source of really interesting objections. Keep out there, keep doing it. If you other guys have objections, I know you have real interesting objections too. Believe me, and with different groups. I just haven't heard as many of them. So I'm just unaware. But you are welcome to share them with me. So I'm going to do a good evening. We will be back again. God bless. Let me close us with prayer with the cool music behind me. I've never had my own soundtrack when I prayed before, so this is really cool. Our Father, our King, thank you for the community here. It is so wonderful to be able to have people and really neat people. I haven't gotten to know all of them personally as far as seeing all of them. And yet we are knit together across different locations. And I have felt like I've gotten to know them and prayed for some of them and learned more about them as time goes on. And in their own way, they're confronting the world with the gospel. That is so exciting. In their own way, in their own time, and they're anxious to get more of the way this all works. And so am I. And so it's so beautiful to be able to learn together and to be together. May you bless their evening, allow them to find rest and your peace, and commune with you in the night watches. And may you continue to build them up. May we continue to grow together and move forward as you end up teaching us more about this wonderful worldview that is the true worldview. And I ask these things in Jesus' name.